Good afternoon, CBC Alderton, and perhaps some guests out there as well. Welcome you to our first Table Talk. This is aiming to be a little bit of a devotional chapel service during our time of restricted gathering. We want to serve you with some devotional thoughts that we hope will encourage you. Myself, I will typically be doing Tuesdays. Andrew will typically do Wednesdays. And Luke will likely be doing Thursdays. And Friday we might do some sort of Q&A session or a podcast style. Andrew's going to be looking at the Psalms, and Luke, some family style devotionals. I'm going to be looking at a New Testament epistle. But before doing that, I thought it might be helpful to sort of get into our minds in terms of how we've made decisions, in terms of what our worship practices look like now that we've been so restricted in terms of our social gathering because of COVID-19. Andrew and I and some of our elders as well have done a lot of reading in terms of church history and how has the church responded to pandemics in the past. We have, of course, looked to God's Word to inform us and prayed as well. Like I said in my sermon from 2 weeks ago, what would God have us to do? And so toward that end, I thought it might be helpful before I look into an epistle, that'll be next week, to look at the church, look at church history. And this has really helped to shape and inform our response as a church. You know, I was thinking that our modern world is really faced with two things that humans have always struggled with, and that is uncertainty and death. Uncertainty and death. And in spite of, you think of the staggering advances that we've got in terms of dealing with pandemics and understanding of virology and epidemiology that we've never had before, and yet I would argue that we're probably least able to face the things that really bother us on the inside about this. We might be able to deal with the sick and the illness side of the pandemic better, but are we dealing any better with the spiritual side of things, the social side of things? And I would suggest that we're not. For us to find the resources to help our communities to face the fear of uncertainty and death, I want to encourage us to look at the Lord and His Word, but also this morning, or this afternoon, to look at the past. How has the Lord led Christians to deal with similar circumstances through its history? And of course, that history starts with the teachings of Christ themselves. I want to look at 3 verses. You can turn there if you like, but I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, so maybe just listen. Well, in Mark chapter 12, of course, verses 30 and 31, we get that great quote from Christ that says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." It's the second of the 2 great commandments. We are to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. He also said, "Greater love has no man than this, that he should lay down his life for his friends." We find that in John chapter 15, verse 13. And then in the Sermon on the Mount, of course, he says, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." I think those 3 verses really shape and frame a Christian ethic. It puts quite a different perspective on things, doesn't it? The Christian ethic in general, and certainly in times of pandemics, is that our own life is to be regarded as less important than our neighbors. Well, how about once we get into the church age? That's what Jesus said. How have the churches approached pandemics? Well, 2 plagues during the Roman Empire are particularly noteworthy. Now, at that point, in the 2nd century, when the first plague hit, it was called the Antonine Plague, from about 160 AD to 180 AD. At that point, the Christian faith was still relatively small, but growing. That plague was incredibly significant to the Roman Empire, and it is said to have killed off about 1/4 of the population. At one point, historians note that there were about 2,000 deaths per day at its peak, and that included two Roman emperors, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. The numbers in total were probably of the order of 60 to 70 million throughout the empire. And as you can imagine, the effects were dramatic. It weakened the Roman military. For instance, for the first time in over 200 years, Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine to confront the Romans. The economy was wrecked, social, political impact as well. You can imagine, just because of the deaths alone, the number of able men that were not able to serve their communities because of the plague. Many attribute the decline, in fact, of the Roman Empire to these two plagues. Now, interestingly, during the plague, Christianity expanded. Christians cared for the sick, and perhaps just as important, offered a completely new worldview. A plague was not the work of some angry deities, but it was the product of a broken creation. And because of that broken creation, it was a creation in revolt against a loving God. The second plague that I mentioned, there are two plagues noteworthy in the Roman Empire. The second plague was known as the Plague of Cyprian, and it occurred between roughly 250 AD to 270 AD, about 20 years. It was named after Saint Cyprian, who was the bishop of Carthage. Now, at its peak, historians write that there were 5,000, up to 5,000 deaths per day. Besides the plague itself, there was constant warfare, coincidental droughts, famines, and floods, and it also claimed the lives of two Roman emperors, Justinian and Claudius II. Again, though, the church grew fantastically during this second plague. You can look up, I think it's the Ancient History Encyclopedia, which is secular in nature, but it notes that the only institution to thrive amidst this chaos was Christianity. Again, the beliefs of the time offered no explanation for the cause of the plague or suggestions as to how to prevent further illness, much less actions toward caring for the sick and the dying. Christians, on the other hand, played an active role in caring for the ill, as well as actively providing care to the burial of the dead. Cyprian's sermons told Christians not to grieve for plague victims who live in heaven, but to redouble efforts to care for the living. A fellow bishop named Dionysius described how Christians, heedless of danger, took charge of the sick, attending to their every need. And we don't just read of this from the eyes of Christian historians either. The notably pagan Emperor Julian complained how the Galileans, and that was what he referred to Christians as, the Galileans, the Galileans would care for even non-Christian sick people. Good was done to all men, not merely the household of faith. Some of you might know the modern-day sociologist Rodney Stark. He's written a number of interesting books. He suggests that death rates in cities with Christian communities could have been half of that of those of other cities. But how about as we move through history? The great reformer Martin Luther had much to say, and perhaps if you've been reading blogs or online periodicals, Christian periodicals, one essay in particular has been noted by a number of blogists, and that is the essay that Luther wrote in 1527 as the plague, the bubonic plague. It had been a couple of hundred years since it had really ravaged Europe, but it was now coming back, and it had affected Wittenberg. where Martin Luther was living at the time. And there were many calls to flee the city, and certainly calls upon Luther, who was, by that point, 10 years into the Reformation, and of course, the significant figurehead of the Reformation. And he was called to protect himself, flee the city and protect himself. But he chose to stay, and he opened his own home with Caterina to minister to the sick, in addition to all the preaching he was doing, all the teaching, even advising city council. To him, it was an opportunity to preach Christ. He wrote this essay, Whether One May Flee from a Deadly Plague. And it's an interesting, if long, read. I recommend it to you. His own actions, interestingly, may have actually led to the death of his own daughter, Elizabeth. Now, the tone of this essay would imply that Christians ought to have this die-at-the-post mentality. Pastors don't abandon their congregations. Doctors don't leave hospitals. Sorry for the light there. Well, doctors don't leave hospitals, and officials don't stop governing. In short, we don't abandon our duty. One great quote that Pastor Andrew came across today, and as we were talking, I thought, oh, I gotta have that. Send that over to me. Well, Luther wrote this. This I well know, that if it were Christ or his mother who were laid low by illness, everybody would be so solicitous and would gladly become a servant or helper. Everyone would want to be bold and fearless. Nobody would flee, but everyone would come running. If you wish to serve Christ and to wait on him, very well, you have your sick neighbor close at hand. Go to him and serve him, and you will surely find Christ in him. Now, that being said, even Luther himself did not condemn those who chose to flee the city. He thought of it as a matter of conscience. And he said it's a natural response of a human, for instance, to leave a burning building. And that self-preservation is actually God-given. So he didn't condemn those who chose to flee, but he did, I think it's also fair to say, command that those who have responsibility, so consider what your vocation is before the Lord and honor that. And so, like I say, pastors don't abandon congregations, and civic officials don't abandon their posts either. Now I think it's at this point maybe good to go back to the words of Christ. At this point, you might be thinking, well, how do I then square our response today with how the church has responded during some of its past? And I think we have to, again, let's go back to the words of Christ. What does loving our neighbor look like? That is our command, to love our neighbor. The Christian ethic is to prefer others. And so the value, if you will, of their life is greater than our life. And so what does loving our neighbor look like today? Well, for one thing, I think it is fair to recognize that we do have a greater understanding of viruses, what's called germ theory. For the common person, helping the sick and the dying is, of course, not only exposing themselves to danger, but all of the healthy people that they come across as well. And so I think it is fair to ask, is that loving your neighbor? Christians are, of course, also called to serve the marginalized in our society, those that are vulnerable. If we continue to gather, does that really serve those who are most vulnerable? As I said 2 Sundays ago in my sermon on Philippians 4, it isn't just about whether we have faith or we have a God-given strength to endure an illness. It's how about those that are living around us and those that are vulnerable, not only in our own community, our faith community, but in the broader community. So again, what does loving our neighbor look like? It's interesting to note the more modern response of the church as well, and I don't mean today, even as far back as 1918, when the Spanish flu hit, it was interesting to see the church's responses there. By that point, of course, we did have some understanding then of the role of hygiene in managing and containing the flu. 9 Marks is a great ministry that serves churches, and they've written extensively on this. They've put together a number. You can look this up online, just search 9 Marks, and you'll see that they've got articles. I've read articles, interestingly, from pastors that are in China, from pastors that are in Spain in this day, and how are they serving their congregations? How are they reflecting on what loving our neighbor looks like? Well, in Washington, D.C., there was originally some pushback to the kinds of call that we're getting from our civic leaders today, and that is to shut down schools and shut down institutions such as churches. But ultimately, they did see it as one, being submissive to civic authority, and so they did abide by the prohibition against gathering. But they also saw it as serving their neighbor, that we serve each other, and it's out of love that we practice good hygiene, and it's out of love that we practice physical distancing. That has been our message consistently to you as well, that we don't want our mindset to be that this is the best way to protect ourselves, but rather this is the best way to serve our community. The church also, in 1918, interestingly, looked at it still as an opportunity. So many of them held outdoor services. Now, we're not allowed to do that in our community, in our province, but in the time, at first, they started running outdoor meetings. Those ultimately were shut down, actually. So I think all of these things have helped to inform us as we've looked as leadership to both the Word and to prayer, to have God inform us, but also to the church and to even other pastors in other nations and how they're dealing with this crisis. It has caused us, I think, to also look at what the church is. And Andrew and I have been really, really encouraged in this last week by having the Lord distill in us what are the primary aspects of what church is, and what can we still do? What opportunity do we still have to love God and love our neighbor? And we've endeavored to do that through all the various ways that we've set up, a lot of it virtual, online. We encourage you to get in touch with us in these ways, these types of things on Facebook. We're rolling out all of our adult ministry this week and next week. Men's and women's Bible studies. The life groups will again start to meet. It's not the same, and we recognize that. The church is out of a word, ecclesia, the Greek word ecclesia, and it means a couple of things. One, it means the gathered ones. Well, our gathering now is severely restricted, and it hurts. As I said Sunday morning, even doing the call to worship, it doesn't feel right when you're reciting the word and then praying over a congregation that you cannot see. And there are ways in which we can't care for another and bear one another's burdens when we're not physically present. But the ecclesia also means to be set apart. And there are ways in which we are still set apart as a church. This doesn't change our confession. It doesn't change what we believe. It doesn't change our mission. There are many ways in which we can still be on mission. We command you to be on mission. We've told you adopt a senior, adopt a community member. Now that can't be by actually having them over in your home during this time, but it can be that you give them a call, that you serve them in some way. We're looking at setting up a network of care for our congregation, and we will be impacted by COVID-19. We know that. And so there will be opportunities for us to serve each other. And so let's look at those ways, not the ways in which we are not the church right now, but look at the ways in which we still are the church, and that our worship really isn't just restricted, of course, to the big event on a Sunday morning. We are the church 7 days a week and 24 hours a day. Thanks for joining us today. Join us again tomorrow at 3:30 for our next installment of Table Talk. Goodbye.